Okay, so now we can move to the part where we actually configure the tool and run it. So in order to run the migration tool, first we'll need to have inside the folder, we'll need to have the jar file, the migration utility, and the two configuration files, the config example JSON file, which is the main configuration file, and a user mapping file, which is used to map the users between QC project and LM Octane workspace. The users will not be mapped, they will be mapped using this file, and also they are mapped automatically by login name and by email address. Okay, so let's start with the beginning, the configuration file. I will edit this file. So the configuration file is made up of multiple steps, and this is a default JSON file that comes with the migration tool. So when you will open the file, you will just have all of those parameters, default parameters set up in here. But we will walk through all of the parameters step by step. So the first thing that needs to be configured are the ALM repositories and Octane repositories. So here we'll need to configure first for LMQC the location, which is the URL of the LMQC project. We can take that by here. We'll just post it here in this format, till QC bin format. Okay, and the next part will be the project name, project domain, the credentials, and also the server time zone. Okay, so the project name will be demo project. The project domain will be default, so you can see it here, and the credentials SA and with no password. And the server time zone, which should represent the time zone where the ALM repository is located, and it should be in a Java format time zone, and this will make alignments between the LMQC server and the UTC timeline time zone. So going on, we have the Octane configuration. It's basically more or less the same as the LMQC. So what we need to do here is to put the URL of LM Octane. Word. Of course, and now we need to give the share space and the space and the workspace name or IDs. We can choose both options. You can go either with the name or with the ID of the workspace and space. So to do that, we can take the name from here. Also, we can take the IDs from the URL. So the first one will represent the ID of the space, which is 1002, and the second one the ID of the workspace, which is 2001. So if we go in here, we'll change that to the right ones. Okay, and after that we have the client ID and client secret parameters, and those parameters, we'll take them back here. And if you go to API access, field migration, API, and we'll take those credentials. Okay, so now in the next part of the configuration file, we have the parameters for performance and limitation of the tool. So in order to view and to be able to understand in more depth more of all of those parameters that can be present here, we can find them inside the user guide here in performance and limitations. If we go to the top, we have performance and limitations, and we can view here all of the available parameters that can be set up for this part of the configuration file. Now the first parameter in this part of the configuration file is the thread count parameter, and this represents the amount of concurrent entities migrated at once. So it's set to 6 in our case. It can be set to 1 up until 6. So it's the maximum number that we have right now. The next parameters are for the bulk update migration. So this parameter by default is set to true. So we can, in this case, we can choose to not include this here, but also we can set it to false if we want, but in our case it should be true. Okay, and the next one represents the size of the batch for the bulk operation migration. Okay, the next one will be enable shared releases. This is more related when migrating inside an Octane shared space, because, for example, in an Octane shared space, the releases can be shared across workspaces, and in this case, by setting this parameter to false, you can choose to not share them across workspaces. The next parameter will be the migration of history. So history can be migrated by the migration tool in different formats as an attached file. So basically the migration tool will take the history of the entity from QC and it will attach it to the new entity in Octane, and you can choose to make this attachment to be a PDF file, an XLS, or an HTML file. So in our case, we're going to go with the PDF file, and the history migration is triggered inside the command line when we run the tool, but we will take a look on that also later on. Okay, we also have here the user mapping file. So in order for the user mapping file to be taken into consideration, we need to map it here inside this parameter. The next parameter will be about the string character length of the fields. So by default, this is set to unlimited, but it depends on Octane, in which Octane you are trying to migrate, because some of them might have some limitations on that. And if so, in order to avoid the failure of that entity when it's migrated, you can set up the parameter here, and then you will avoid the failure when migrating to Octane. Okay, and for example, the next parameter, what actually it will do, it will append all of the design steps to the description inside the ALM Octane manual test. Okay, and the next parameters are a default set of parameters that come with the configuration file. So basically, these are some queries for the requirements migration. So basically, what those queries do is that it will migrate the requirement folder query. It will migrate the requirement documents, the requirement folder and the requirement documents, and also it will migrate the root folder of the requirements inside ALM Octane. Also, those queries can be overwritten inside the command line when we run the tool by adding multiple filters to it, but we can check that also a little bit later. Okay, the next part will be the migration of the configuration of parameters that are used to migrate the application modules. So as you know, in ALM QC we can have a folder structure, a 3-folder structure for the test sets and for the manual test. And there is an option to migrate the folder structure as well inside the application module view of the Octane. And actually, in order to enable this migration, we need to set up those parameters. So for example, here we have the setup for the manual test folder structure. So we're going to give it a name, root folder name. This name test folder will appear inside ALM Octane. We can give it any other name we'd like here. There are different modes on how the tree structure will be migrated. The main one will be merge mode. Actually, merge mode will merge all of the folders and keep the hierarchy exactly as it is in ALM QC. Okay, more information about the other modes can be found also on the user guide. There is also, we have the bottom up mode, for example, that will migrate all of the folders from the bottom to up, so in another direction. But merge will be the most popular one. Okay, the next parameter will be for the setup of the maximum depth of the folder structure. So we have here set up to 10, and what it will be past the 10th level of folders, then it will not be migrated into 11th level, it will just be put into the same 10th level. We can increase this also from here, from this parameter, but we can also increase the limitation and the depth from inside the LM Octane at parameters. Okay, and the next parameter here will be we also have the option to include empty folders. So for example, if you have a folder structure with empty folders that doesn't have any manual tests or test sets, you could choose also to include the migration of those ones or not to. And also we have the option to sort by name. That means that it will be posted in an alphabetical order, all of the folder names. Okay, now the next part of the configuration file is the list mapping part. So for this part we have also some default values already set up that comes with the configuration file. And for example, for all of the lists here, so we have the bug status, which is the system field, the system list inside LMQC, which is mapped to the workflow bug status phase from defect status phase from LM Octane, and all of those mappings are done by default. So for severity, for example, also for defects, the priority, plan status, and status. Those are for manual runs and for tests. Now, as for the other lists from LMQC project, they will be automatically migrated to LM Octane if the list will be used by any of the fields of defects, requirements, manual tests, and so on. So only then the UDF, the custom lists, will get migrated to Octane, but there is a parameter also that can be set up. It's called Lookup List, and with that parameter set to true, then you can choose to migrate all of the lists inside the LMQC project, regardless if they are used by some field or not. And for those system lists here, for example, for priority and severity, we have those values. The severity is the list identifier from LMQC project. We also have a default mapping, so in case a defect in LMQC doesn't have a severity set, then the migration tool will automatically set the value low when it will migrate the entity inside Octane. Okay, and then we have the actual mapping from the value from LMQC and to the value of the Octane entity. And for example, here you can choose to map. So, for example, if you have multiple values inside LMQC severity list, then you can choose to map them automatically to those system list values from Octane. Otherwise, they will get created over the values of LMQC if they will not be mapped. And the same goes for all of the lists mapped here in this part of the configuration. Okay, so now the next part of the configuration file will be the field configuration, the field mapping for each entities. So also here the configuration file comes with a default mapping and a default configuration. But to better understand the migration of all of the fields, you just need to know that, for example, all of the system fields from LMQC are mapped automatically to some of the system fields from LM Octane if it's the same type of system field, and for the ones that are not, the tool will not be able to find an equivalent of the system field in Octane, it will automatically create a UDF. And you can see all of those mappings and exactly their target field in Octane by viewing the functional scope document for defects, for requirements, for manual tests, and so on. And the UDF fields from LMQC will automatically be created in LM Octane, and you don't need to map them inside the configuration file. Now we will talk a little bit about the parameters that already exist here and that are by default. Now, the first parameter will create a trace type UDF field in Octane for defects for traceability purposes. And also, if you want to map or to migrate one field from LMQC to a desired name of the field inside Octane, you can fill in parameters in this format. So, for example, for at field identifier, you need to put in the name of the field from LMQC, and then you can tell the migration tool exactly on how this field should be called, what is the name of this field in Octane, and also the label. And of course, you have the option to enable the migration of that field or to disable it. So you can choose for each field to enable or to disable its migration. Also, there is the option, an extra parameter that can be added up in the second part of the configuration file add limitations that will limit the migration of the UDF field. Okay, moving on, we have the execution date field, run execution date field from QC, and this is set to true. So this means that this field will be taken into consideration inside the migration. If this field is set to false, then the migration of all manual runs will fail. So this you need to be careful with this field to make sure every time it's set to true. Also, we have the option to disable or enable comments and attachments in migration. So for example, if I don't want to have any comments or attachments, I can just disable the comments and attachments from the configuration file, and the migration tool will ignore them. Also, there is an option to append multiple fields to another field. For example, this is what this parameter will do. So for example, we have the BG description field, and this means that when it will be migrated, it's regarding the defects, and when the defects will be migrated to Octane, in the description field, the priority and estimated fixed time fields will be appended to the description field when all of this will be migrated to Octane. Of course, moving on, we also have the same append for requirements. So we have the field identifier, for example, rqrec comment. This is the equivalent of the rich text field or tab inside the LMQC project. And what this parameter will do, it will append the rich text content inside the description field of requirement documents. When configuring fields for requirement documents or for requirements, you need to also have this parameter entity type to tell the migration tool if you're referring to a requirement document or a requirement folder. Okay, and the last default parameter set up for the field configuration part is for requirement documents, and in this case, the target cycle set up in the target cycle field of the requirements, it will be converted as a long string value inside the LM Octane requirement. Okay, and moving on to the last part of the configuration file, we have the default values configuration. This probably is the most simple one, the most simple part of the configuration file. And what this actually will do, by using those parameters, you can choose different fields and values from those fields, and to set them as default when migrating to Octane. So for example, in this case, we have for defects, we can see that we have a default value set up for phase and severity fields inside the defects, and each time a defect will be migrated to Octane. For example, if a defect in Octane misses the phase, it doesn't have any value for the phase, then the migration tool will automatically put this value new inside Octane when it will be migrated. And this goes the same for manual test. We set up a default value ready for phase. For manual runs, also with releases and native status, we have a default values, and for requirement documents. Okay, so this sums it all pretty much about the configuration file and the format of it. Let's just save it for now. Okay, and the next one I want to move to is the user mapping file. So basically what you need to understand in the first place about the users is that the migration tool will not migrate the users. and it just has the ability to map the users. So for example, all of the users from QC, if you want to have the same user, they will have to be present on the Octane side, on the Octane space level, for example, because the migration tool will have the ability then to assign each user from the space level to the relevant workspace in which you are migrating. But it won't actually migrate the users, it will just map them. So for this, we have some parameters set up. So for example, we can, in the first place, we can set up a default Octane user. So this will be the ID of the user from ALM Octane. And for example, if an entity has a user field and a user set up there, and that user cannot find its equivalent user, or it's not mapped in the configuration file here, then this user 1001 will be automatically assigned by default to the Octane defect when it will be migrated. Okay, and also you can set up different roles for the users. So for example, this role, the tester role will be assigned to my default user when it will be assigned to the relevant workspaces in which I am migrating. Okay, and after that we can do the mappings part. So basically this one is pretty simple. So we just have the user ID from LMQC and the user ID from LM Octane, and the mapping will be done. So this will be one way to map the users using this file, but also the migration tool has the capability to automatically identify if the users are present in the Octane side as well as in the QC side. Then the migration tool will have the ability to identify those users by their login name. So if they have the same login name, for example, James_ALM is the login name of both users, then the migration tool will automatically identify those login names and it will map them automatically. And the same goes if they have the same email address. So so this will be an option to have all of the users already existing in Octane, and you can basically skip all of the mappings inside this file. So the migration tool has this capability also.